Kami LaFalcia. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book, and I thought I'd pick a light, cheery topic today. We're going to do Death is But a Dream by Dr. Christopher KERR, K-E-R-R. Dr. KERR is a CEO and Chief Medical Officer at Hospice Buffalo, New York. Born and raised in Toronto, so he's Canadian, KERR earned his MD as well as a PhD in neurobiology, so he's really smart, and completed his residency in internal medicine at the University of Rochester. His research has received international attention and been featured in the New York Times, Atlantic Monthly, and the BBC. He lives on a horse farm. That's interesting, in New York. He has a whole bunch of videos on YouTube, some shorter than others, interviewing people, talking, being interviewed, interviewing patients, being interviewed by other people about the subject matter in this book. And this is Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End. And it's self-explanatory as we go through, so I'm not going to belabor it. It's really interesting, full of very interesting stories. And it was written in 2020. And it's dedicated to the bookends of my life, strong women, from his grandmother to his daughters. I thought that was very nice. It says a lot about a man. So there's a quote at the introduction. In examining disease, we gain wisdom about anatomy and physiology and biology. In examining the person with disease, we gain wisdom about life. And that's a quote from Oliver Sacks. So this book is full of examples of patients, conversations that he had with patients, part of a larger study, which we'll get into. So I try very hard to condense the story without losing the description. So we're talking about the first patient he mentions, Tom, who's 40 and who had AIDS, and he was in the Buffalo hospice. And he was very much alone, and Dr. KERR said, he's very, very literary, very poetic. He says, was Tom refusing to give death an audience because he chose to be alone? The doctor was happy to observe Tom, who was young but had been very fit, and he hoped that that would prolong his time so that he could, come to peace with it. And he told the nurse that Tom himself told the nurse that he was going to live a lot longer just because he was fit. And her response was, well, to Dr. KERR was, Tom is dying and he's been dreaming about his dead mom. Now, this is important because, as we're going to find out in the book, people have kind of a predictable pattern of experiences as they approach death, and it is almost predictive. And the nurse was older, wiser, been around a lot, and she had to dispel the notion that Tom was giving the doctor, that because he was all young and strong and fit, he was going to be fine, he was going to be around a long time. And her greater knowledge of what happens around death indicated to her that he was much closer to death than he was admitting, or that maybe he realized. And he said to the nurse, I don't remember that class in medical school. And she said to him, this is great, son, you must have missed a lot of classes. So he was only 30. He was a cardiology fellow, which is, you finished your internship and you're doing your residency and you're specializing. And he was working weekends at the hospice to pay bills because, they don't get paid very much as residents. So he proceeded to treat this patient, Tom, at the hospice with life-extending procedures. And then Tom was dead in 48 hours. The nurse was right. So now we're going to, not treating the loss, the grief, the fear, the emotions that go around death for many people. I'm not intentionally treating them cavalierly and lightly. But once you get into this book, you'll see. So Nancy, the nurse, knew that he was going to die soon. How did she know? And Dr. Kerr asks himself, is she just a pessimist? But it was her experience with the subjective aspects of dying. And in his medical training, he learned how patients experienced illness, but death itself was very much ignored in medical training. He had never considered death as anything but the enemy to defeat. He didn't ever consider that patients might have wishes around their death, or be able, either the patient or him, be able to acknowledge that death was inevitable. So eventually, his experience with the dying taught him that their dreams and the dreams were predictive, and that they helped them to face death with love and meaning and grace, and that most moved on from worrying about treatments to focus on the personal meaning of what they were going through and the inevitability. Paradoxically, these dreams, we're talking about death here, paradoxically, it was all very life-affirming. He found that difficult at first. Pre-death dreams and visions are a time of integration and a coming into oneself. And they often occur, for most people, now we're talking about people who are dying of a process, a disease process. This is not necessarily going to be somebody in a car wreck or, a sudden drop dead in a heart attack situation. These are people who have a lingering illness and they're in hospice, and, people who die of old age, that kind of thing. That these dreams and visions, and yes, we're talking real visions, they occur in the last days and hours of somebody's life, and they provide genuine insight into the process of dying. And they help to bring people who witness this from distress about their situation to an acceptance, a tranquility, and a wholeness. And he said almost entirely every patient who has these dreams and visions talk about them as more real than real. They often come from the context of the life of the patient. They're very personal. They will often relive insignificant events with loved ones. People will be in their deathbed and semi-responsive off and on. And they will be having these experiences that they will, we're often able to become more interactive and express what was going on, and that's how he knew. Long-lost loved ones will return to reassure people or to tie up loose ends of a difficult relationship, to revisit them and to forgive conflicts. And his point of view is that this ought to be recognized by doctors, by medical professionals. This is a proof of humanity's spiritual capacity and healing. They give meaning to the end of life. This is a process, and the patient should have a say in how it goes, and it also gives peace and relief to those that are left behind. These events, these experiences, dreams and visions, they don't just help the person who's dying. They're a great comfort to family members, friends, and caregivers. It's hard work taking care of dying people. It's very emotionally impactful. So at their most frail and vulnerable, these are powerful reminders of their real essence. So this is a person, this doctor, who was not particularly philosophical, and there was an experience that taught him much. The paradox of dying is the patient is spiritually and emotionally more and more alive as they approach physical death. They are remarkably aware. They're sharp in their dreams. It's not about drug situations or confusion or whatever. Senility or the side effects of medical disorders. It's not that. So there's a book called Tuesdays with Maury, and this is a quote. Aging is not just decay, it's growth. It's more than the negative that you're going to die. This is also true of the dying process, which often functions as a summing up, a culmination, and a capstone, an opportunity to recognize and celebrate our humanity in all its complexity and dignity, rather than just as an ending. So, examples. Patient called Kenny, who was 76, the father of 5, and in his dreams, he was 5 years old and back with his mother, who died when he was 6. And his mother was visiting him on his deathbed in his dreams and told him over and over, "I love you." Example of Deb, who was 91 and who was visited by 6 deceased family members who told her that they were waiting for me. She said it was comforting. She had a dream of being driven away by a childhood friend and an aunt standing by telling her to let go. These are very common sorts of dreams. Sierra, 28, was in denial of the cancer that she had. She had a 4-year-old child. She was only 28. This was very difficult. And she kept telling all the medical staff at the hospice, she's in hospice, but such denial. She kept telling them, I'm going to beat this, I'm going to beat this. And she was visited by her deceased grandfather, who told her, stop struggling against this. Don't suffer anymore. Have the strength to just let go and lose your fear. And she did. She died 4 days later. Jessica, who was 13, had dreams that she was loved and would be fine. It's always a little bit different for children because, they haven't had enough time on earth to experience a lot of loss and a lot of people in their lives that they would necessarily recognize. If you're a 4-year-old and you're dying, it's not likely you're going to very clearly remember grandparents and aunts and uncles, etc., and who have died before you, and unlikely that you'll have a wide circle of friends that you've outlived. So Jessica was told she would be fine. And modern medicine needs to see death not as a failure and not get in the way of the process of dying. But he says, modern medicine dismisses anything it can't manage. That medicine has more comfort with questions about the brain than it does with questions about the mind. They would more likely to write off the dying as confused or drugged or hallucinating. And he says this is a very limited view. Now remember, this guy's an expert in neurology, and he's saying no, we're not talking about people who are confused by their physical disorder or their medication. Medical staff should be leading the way. They should not be engaging. And in this hospice, they did not, but he learned from them that medical staff needs to stop denying death and not medicating people into a coma if they're not in pain. They should encourage talk with the patient and the family and address the psychological, emotional, and spiritual well-being of all of these people, and let the patient take the lead about how all this should be done. Very few in the medical field, scientific field, have researched death by actually just asking the dying. A little too simple, Medicine is all about defying death. And he knew that if he was going to get this message out to the medical professionals, that he needed evidence-based language. He needed to approach it like a scientist. So he got data with structured interviews. And he said they would need more than just that to bring doctors back to the bedside of the dying and to not think that they were only going to be extending life. Patients are reluctant to discuss these significant experiences because they're fully aware of the ridicule or the questioning that they are received. Lots of questions about the legitimacy of what they've been experiencing. And this is very isolating for people. Science has accelerated and it has obscured the art of medicine. It's uncomfortable with the subjective. And that's because, everyone has his or her own worldview, and they're very uncomfortable about it from a scientific point of view. And he says, this is Montaigne, if you know not how to die, never trouble yourself. Nature will in a moment fully and sufficiently instruct you. She will exactly do that business for you. Take you no care for it. So he said the richest and most thoughtful discussions about death actually don't come from science. They come from the humanities, from most religious and philosophical traditions. And he gives you a list. And this has always been available, but it's very obscured by modern medicine. Our 20th, 21st century approach to objective over-medicalization of mortality is obscuring the greater spiritual and philosophical aspects of dying. Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, I hope I said that right, is an exploration of aging and death and medicine. And it starts with the story by Tolstoy of Ivan Ilyich, the death of Ivan Ilyich. And I recently, just coincidentally, reread that. And it had been 50, 60 years since I'd read it. And it's short. And I got a lot out of it. I won't belabor it, but it's really an incredible study of somebody dying and how their family is. So he says there are other examples out there in literature. We should turn to literature to make sense of mortality because medicine doesn't do it. The dying yearn for insight. And let's face it, we're all dying. So maybe it's time to start thinking about this, and reading about it, and discussing it. In 2015, he gave a TED Talk and did some articles and did a documentary, and he received an overwhelming response for them. He said there's a real need. There's obviously a need to open up this dialogue, this conversation. The tragedy of death, he said, it's not dimming of the light. That's not the tragedy, rage against the dimming of the light. No, he said it's enlightening, and it's tragedy that we don't. It's easier to live longer and harder to die well. We have lost our way. That's a very profound statement. So despite their wishes, most Americans die alone in an institution. We don't have the infrastructure for dealing with this situation. And exploring the non-physical experience of death puts real richness into the whole meaning of what's going on. Rilke said, I will not say that one should love death, but one should love life so magnanimously, so without calculation and selection, that spontaneously one constantly includes with it and loves death too, life's averted half. Only because we exclude death has it turned more and more into something alien, something hostile. The end of life testifies to our need to love and be loved. That's what comes up all the time with the dying. Our need to be nurtured, to feel connected, and to be remembered and forgiven. These are all issues that arise with dying people. We just don't know because we're not paying attention. So forgiveness and love comes to the dying very often in dreams of family and close acquaintances and friends. And doctors need to stand out of the way. That's his conclusion. So now that was the introduction. This is a really good book. Now we're going to get to chapter 1, From There to Here. He says, despite a huge amount of education, young doctors know about disease and the organs, but not about illness and people. The last part of their training is lifelong. It's what they do when they interact with patients. They have to learn how to listen, to hear, and tend to the soul. And once again, this is not a religious person, but terminology is terminology, and I don't, not to put too much denominational weight on anything he says. So his first such patient was Mary, who was 70. She had the mother of 4 in the hospice, and her whole family would come in and visit and drink wine, and there was a lot of camaraderie. And suddenly, and she was kind of out of it, suddenly she sat up in bed and started cuddling an invisible baby and calling it Danny and kissing it in kind of a state of bliss almost. Her family was shocked. What's wrong with her? Is she hallucinating? Is she on drugs? And he said he realized that it was beyond medical reach. There was nothing really wrong with her. It was nothing that needed to be treated. She was very serene and peaceful and happy about this, but the family was freaked out. They were overwhelmed. Well, the next day, Mary's sister came, and she explained to everybody that Mary had had a first baby named Danny, who was stillborn, and that she had been absolutely inconsolable, overcome with grief, and never the rest of her life ever spoke about it. Her family had no idea. And this baby returned to her at her death. At her death's door, she was revisiting the trauma and achieving peace about it, coming to peace, and she died happily and peacefully. Okay, so Dr. KERR himself says that the irony of his own life is not lost on him. His father died when he was 12. He was alone with his father. His dad was getting ready, told him, I'm gonna take you fishing, and was very happy. And I guess he had a heart attack and was in the hospital, and the dad kind of came out of his coma and started talking about, well, I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to take you fishing, and seemed really, really happy. And the priest who was there told the 12-year-old Dr. KERR, now your father's delusional, he doesn't know what he's saying. And his father died that night, and it was vulnerable age for KERR. He was only 12, and he said the loss remained with him for the rest of his life. His father had been a doctor. He had a good job, but if you're averse to death, if you have an aversion to death, it's especially a good job, because death's never mentioned when you're a doctor. They don't talk about it. They defy it. They fight against it. It's the enemy. They deny it. They never say the word. So as a resident, he was working 80 to 100 hours a week. And he said that they would have patients which they would do what's called signing off. They would stop following the patient for treatment, kind of wash their hands of them because they were terminal. They said, well, there's nothing more that we can do. And he says, this is common. And it's institutional abandonment of the dying. And you especially see this in nursing homes. It's really mind-boggling how many people in nursing homes have no visitors. It's remarkable. He said, caregivers, family, friends, those who are interested can be present and can relieve people's suffering and isolation. So he's 1999 and he's a cardiology fellowship, and he's struggling to make ends meet with 2 kids and 1 income. And he needed a job that he could come and go without giving them notice, because he would have a pager and they could just call him if they needed him at the hospice. And as a resident, he was supposed to be working 24/7, so he was trying to, do 2 things at once. And he saw an ad in the paper for this doctor needed at a hospice, and he said he had managed to weasel his way out of hospice and geriatric rotations when he was being trained. He said most doctors do that. They avoid facing death and often don't take those classes if they're optional. Death avoidance is a model of care, and in a fee-for-service marketplace based on output and volume of billable services, it's easier to get a CAT scan than it is to find home health for somebody who's dying, because it's not billable by the hour. And he said the nearly dead people who really have, they know there's nothing that they can do for them, are put kind of into an assembly line of scans and blood work and pacemakers, and it's all because they can be billed. So there are protocols, if you have something dire wrong with you, there are protocols of treatment, and there's plenty of documentaries. You can see people spending their last, some of them, couple of years going back and forth in various degrees of treatments. And he says, this is expensive. It's billable. It's expensive. It's the protocol. And, sorry, but it is often, they know the chances are minuscule that they'll do anything for you. They're just billing you. He has a pretty dark view of the whole thing. So to die in the hospital is expensive, and half of dying patients end up in the emergency room because they get to a state of distress and discomfort, and there's no care available for them at home, and the family has to bring them in, and they end up dying in the hospital. So there's a wide bureaucratic gap. Patients are seen as tasks and paperwork. It's reality. Not by the nurses and doctors necessarily, but by the larger system. So he witnessed many destroyed vocations. Oh, okay, I remember. It's been a while since I read this. Many disillusioned doctors who were just really disillusioned by the system. Healing being sacrificed in the name of treatment and forsaken. He walked into an interview ambivalent about, applying for this job in the hospice, because the prevailing attitude of everybody when he told them he was thinking of it, because he's a cardiology big shot, right? What sort of a doctor would work in a hospice? And the interviewer told him that he needed righteous indignation. So after talking with this interviewer, it was like a moment of enlightenment for him. He describes it as enlightenment. He was motivated. He quit cardiology. He was absolutely ridiculed by his peers, and he was told, hospice is what you do when you retire from real medicine. And he was advised to go see a psychiatrist. He was seen as a waste of an education. He saw such a shift in attitude amongst caregivers in the hospital, in the hospice. He saw hospice coworkers transform into attentive caregivers. He had been really disillusioned with the bureaucracy and the impersonal nature of medicine in cardiology. And these new colleagues in hospice helped him to reconnect to the human side of medicine. He had waited, let's see, what did I say here? Okay, he was struck by the patience and caring of the people in hospice. He went once with his father. It reminded him of the old-fashioned doctor his father was. He went once with his doctor doing his rounds, and while his father, the doctor, was seeing a patient, he sat in the emergency room, and he could overhear what his father was saying. And he was really impressed by his father's compassion, the level of care that he was giving a homeless person behind the curtains, in the emergency room. And that level of caring had made such an impression on him. He saw that for his father, it was a privilege to be a doctor, and his father had respect for the humanity of these people. And that was something that he missed in his cardiology work and rediscovered in hospice. He said it wasn't easy at first. He was a neophyte. He says hospice was definitely a movement of nurses. Nurses saw the failure of conventional medicine. They saw the need of the dying. They saw the needless suffering. And, nurses take charge. And they gave compassionate one-on-one personal care. And they showed him that as a doctor, he was no longer, the rooster. He was a supporting role. And they didn't wear white coats and uniforms in hospice because that's too egotistical. It was associated with ego. And he said the patients kept him in check too. So for example, Peter was a retired university professor with pancreatic cancer. And he had been ignored because pancreatic cancer, especially in this time period, there was no hope. And he was suffering quite a bit, but it was a side effect of the medications he was on. So adjusting his medications gave him more energy than he had had, and he was able to engage more and enjoy his life. And they managed, the medical people managed the course of his illness because he still needed care. But just because somebody has an untreatable disease, they have other complaints that you cannot ignore and just let them die in suffering. So, for example, he said, that people will have a fulminating UTI, like a urinary tract infection, or anemia. And because they're dying, they don't do anything about it. And palliative care is, he said, not consent to do nothing. So it's possible to treat pain. It's possible to treat discomfort. So patients seen as terminal are often sent home, and they felt abandoned, that they were in kind of a medical purgatory. And then they had fear of the unknown. And the only other option was really aggressive treatment. But this hospice program offered instead comfort care. And they had been lacking in information. So there was fear, a lack of information, a lack of comfort. Data shows that most of these people died with symptoms of stuff and pain, and it all had gone ignored because they were dying. Or there'd been a poor attempt to relieve the symptoms, a failure to treat them aggressively just for the symptoms, not to defy death, but, and there was no support for family and caregivers. So humans are vulnerable to circumstances, to death, and to each other. And he said what he learned in hospice was the secret for caring for the patient is caring for the patient. It's a holistic approach because a patient's suffering is total. They're not just a pancreas. They're not just an aortic valve, And part of the treatment should be to honor and facilitate the patient's experience of what's going on, to legitimize it, not deny it and ignore it. This is not just a physical decline. This is a really interesting sentence. He says, these patients are not experiencing just a physical decline. They are experiencing a spiritual ascension. So doctors bring to patients what they know, and also who they are, and also how they love, and whom they have lost. Their history, their experience plays into how they treat patients. He said his own father's death shattered him. It left him a magnificent example of questioning of the meaning of life. And this book is an attempt for him to heal from that, an attempt to provide answers even just for himself. So chapter 2, Stumbling Out of the Gate. He had an intern as an intern, he had a patient named Bobby who claimed, I'm okay except for the pink spider on the wall. Do you see them? This pink spider is crawling on the wall. This is an old lady. So this is what she said to him as an intern. He came in and he said, how are you doing? I'm remembering it now. He says, how are you doing? She says, oh, I'm fine except for those pink spiders on the wall. Do you see them? And he said, no. And she said, good, I was testing you. So She did the exact same thing the next day with a different resident. He happened to be in the room and saw her do this. And the resident told her, "Oh, yeah, I see the spiders on the wall." She told him, "Get out, you're nuts, you need help." So the significant part of this is that she felt she needed to test her doctors to see if they'd be truthful, because they didn't have rapport, they didn't have trust. She needed to figure out who would advocate for her, who she could trust, and who was just going to tell her whatever she wanted to hear. So it's hard to understand the inner life of patients because these people are strangers. It helps to have a lot of experience with a lot of dying people and to have your own level of comfort with the whole issue of dying. To the uninitiated, the dreams that these people have can be misunderstood as confusion, dementia, hallucination. It requires insight of the process of death. So he researched shortly after being hired and found there was very little information. There's simply no medical education on this. So this book is his attempt to try to help the medical profession. The humanities were the gateway, he found, to subjective dimensions of the heart. But often they provide a blank canvas on which the observer could impose his or her own beliefs or interpretations. So, fancy way of saying, you bring to your death your own philosophy, your own religious beliefs, your own worldview or spiritual consciousness. And then parapsychology, people saw ghosts, and Freudians, in the context of a dying person hearing these stories, parapsychology, oh, you're seeing ghosts. Freudians say, oh, you're living through repressed desires. Jungians will say, these are hopeful desires. And the religious will say, well, this is the proof of God. It's all about the context, your frame of reference. But most in the humanities would believe that these experiences are a keyhole glimpse into the soul. They don't write them off as delusion. Into the soul and beyond. And very few thought to ask the dying, what does it mean to you? Would seem obvious, right? So sometimes they'd ask a family member or a caregiver. So there have been very few papers, but a poor sampling number, not enough, and very biased, or only speaking to nurses and caregivers, not interviewing patients. It's hard to interview dying patients about dying. That's touchy. So these are all anecdotes too, and the scientific world dismisses those because they're only anecdotes, and they require more scientific rigor to get the attention of the medical field. So he could see there was an urgent need for a direct perspective from the bedside, and it needed to be done in a structured way. So he was working with interns, residents, and students, and he told a young oncology fellow that about what he had planned, to study this, and she wasn't interested at all. She says, I'm here to save lives, not to fight death, and not to help the transition into it. And it blows my mind here that a young doctor would say that. She seemed taken aback when he said, well, you know that people do die of cancer. They don't all survive. So they met a guy called Jack, a World War II vet. And he was having all these dreams about combat from the war. And his wife would not let any of the doctors give him medication to tamp down his dreams. She knew that he was processing important emotions that he had internalized and carried with him all his life. So they tried to test his cognition. They have these series of questions they ask to see if you're with it. They'll say, what day is it? Who's the president of the United States? Well, let's make somebody sick feel worse. Who's the president? So his wife told them, don't ask him that. He hasn't cared about who the president is in years. So she said, the doctor named Maya said, I need to know what he's thinking. And the wife says, well, that's really not important. What's important right now, what he's going through, it's what he's feeling. It's really interesting. So he had PTSD since the war and very disturbing dreams. And he was now finally being guided to a more peaceful evolution of all this. And his wife was determined to let him go through the process. He later asked the doctor, the young woman doctor, now do you believe that these dreams are valid? And she said, well, there's no evidence. So, she wrote them off as biochemical or brain misfunction or drugs. And she said, seeing is believing. And he says, actually, she was right. There had been no research. It was impossible to convince her with one case. She was able to rationalize it away. He realized to get medical students to take these pre-death experiences seriously, that he'd have to medicalize the presenting of it. So he set out to gather quantifiable data from patients. So how to show that this was not just confusion? Well, often, he said, confused have altered mental states, and what they say is dismissed as being of no value. He said it's very critical to be able to distinguish between those two states. Someone who truly is confused and in an altered state, as opposed to somebody who's having this process of pre-death ideation. It's a critical distinction. Delirium, he says, is disorganized thinking and an inability to interact with one's surroundings. These people are clear-headed. They're just having these experiences. Delirium often comes with agitation and restlessness and fear, and you don't see that with these dying patients having these dreams and visions. End-of-life experiences, they have a clear consciousness, heightened acuity, and an awareness of their surroundings. They're not confused. So medical intervention can interfere with the whole process, and it increases the isolation of the dying. Oftentimes, patients will be talking about dreams they've had, and they'll be given sleeping pills because the medical profession is not comfortable even talking about this. And when the medical staff is instructed the way, how we have just talked about the differences, and when they're clearly explained these differences to the medical staff, it makes a huge difference. They begin to be able to distinguish between true dementia, confusion, etc., and a death experience. For example, Brenda was hallucinating that there was a terrifying bear on the wall when she was awake. But in her sleep, she had comforting dreams of dead loved ones who came back for her. She kept saying, I have to go alone. And they gave her anti-anxiety meds that would not knock her out, but ease off the anxiety instead of completely putting her under. It's common for patients to have a delirium at the end of their life experience, but they don't have to totally be gotten away with. And this needs to be researched, is what his point is. Approval by institutional review, the university body, then a review board, said that they were uncomfortable approving projects with human subjects. The dying are vulnerable, and therefore permission is probably not going to be granted to be asking them these really invasive questions. They're protecting the dying, he says, but, they're not engaging with the dying is what they're doing. They're protecting themselves. And it's very isolating and lonely. You can't talk about it. So he had to defend his proposal to the board, and he told them that the patients welcomed the interaction. He said he had never had a dying patient who wasn't happy to have someone to sit and talk with them. So this was a hospice program in a nearby prison, and they spent time talking with the patients, and they had been able to prove that simple presence with a patient was very comforting, And he was able to convince the university board that this would not be invasive or untoward for the patients. So chapter 3, the view from the bed. He had a patient named Frank who was 95, and he was a baseball nerd. He had a head full of baseball facts and numbers, very sharp, very knew all the statistics. So when he closed his eyes, he said, dead relatives came to him, and he complained that they kept him awake. And he said his Uncle Harry won't shut up. Uncle Harry had been dead for 46 years. So as people die, they get more and more sleep and less wakefulness. And wakefulness seems to look more like kind of a semi-slumber. 3 days before his death, Frank, the baseball nut, who had been slipping in and out of awareness, said, I'm in 1927. I'm a boy. How did they do that? He claimed it was a trick, and he was clear-headed, but he swore this happened to him while he was lying there, and it was magic. And Dr. KERR says, well, this man, he had a foot in two worlds. The world of the living and the world of the dead. And he began to dream more and more and more of his wife, who was already dead. And he became more calm and more peaceful. And he requested, after sleeping for a while one day, he requested they stop treatment, that he wanted to go with his wife, who was trying to get him to come with her. And he died shortly after that. So patients like Frank convinced Dr. KERR that a study was a moral imperative. He said the dying needed to be heard, they needed to have their experiences legitimized, and he needed to help doctors see the importance of the end-of-life experience to individuals. So he started working with a Dr. Ann Banas and developed the parameters and an objective approach to this study. These studies had talked with observers, caregivers, and families, but not with patients. So he refers to Dr. Peter Fenwick. And if you remember, about 1.5 years ago, we did a couple of books by Dr. Peter Fenwick, who had extensively interviewed nurses who had sat with the dying and family members who had sat with the dying and relayed stories of what the dying said. He wrote The Art of Dying, and he had an afterlife hypothesis. So he kind of had a point of view going into it, and they didn't actually interview the patients. And those sorts of studies are about the dying. They're not for the dying. He's not saying they're not good. He's just saying they're not quite the angle he wanted to take. His goal was to prove that these experiences exist, that they're routine, and he wanted to get the patient's perspective. So he used a standardized questionnaire with open-ended questions and having a number scale, rate 1 to 5, how likely, how not likely, one of those stupid things with happy faces. So the participants had to sign a detailed consent. They took no patients who had cognitive issues of any sort. They were interviewed every day to create a picture of a process. They were filmed. They filmed the patients to show the diversity of the patients and the clearness of their thought. The patients propelled the research. They were happy to be heard, welcomed the interviews, wanted to be taken seriously, felt that they were a part of something meaningful, that their death had meaning because they were giving back. They didn't want to be alone, and they became collaborative, co-invested, and many of them felt, hey, stars of the show. The medical professionals were unimpressed. The caretakers, the family and friends were the real audience. They were the ones who really saw what was going on. And they were sometimes able to get through to the doctors. So the example is Bridget, 81, with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. She was uneasy about the visions that she was having. She says, why am I having these? Am I going crazy? She kept dreaming of the visit of 2 dead aunts that had been dead a very long time. Then her mother came to her. Now, mind you, this lady's 81. Her mother came to her in a long white dress at a dining room table crocheting. And this poor lady had actually been undergoing kind of a crisis of faith, and she did not expect to see her family. She expected, she was going to be visited by angels. So she was relieved to hear that all this experience she was having was common. It happens to more than 80% of the people dying in their study. Bridget was so relieved that she admitted to him that that this is really interesting. She admitted to Dr. KERR that she was seeing spirits when she was totally awake. She was seeing spirits following the doctors around the halls and in the rooms. Even the ones who didn't believe in any of this, they had these spirits around them. He says that validation of what they're going through transforms the dying experience. It helps patients reconnect to love. These stories have very deep meaning, what they're experiencing. Wounds are healed, bonds are restored. It reunites people with those that they need the most to reunite with. For example, Ryan, age 51, asked him, am I losing my mind? I haven't seen these people in years, they're dead. And he had a clinical remission and his dreams stopped. His disease compromised his social life, but as he got worse in his dreams, he had this great life going on in his head, and it had defined him. So as people approach death, experiences like this increase, and they become much more involved with the dead, and they start spending more time interacting in dreams with the dead, visions with the dead, in kind of a spirit level than they do with other people around them in the room. The nurse who had told the doctor at the beginning of the book, people start to dream about loved ones who are dead. They're very near death. And these dreams of the dead increase dramatically as the live person's death draws near. The dreams are prognosticating. They are predicting the arrival of death. But they do provide great comfort. They bring people peace and comfort that they didn't have. So they were rating things from 0 to 5, remember, on this questionnaire. The comfort level, if people were seeing the dead, their comfort level was between 4 and 5. And if the dreams were about living people, the comfort level was between around 2 out of 5. The presence of dead friends and relatives was the most soothing for 72%. Then the presence of dead pets, I thought that was so interesting. Then if they dreamt about past meaningful experiences, and very last was religious figures. The dying, this whole story, it soothes our fears, and it comes from our basic needs and relationships. There's something very important about bonds and love and relationships, important relationships going on here for people. Rosemary, her last dream was of a family gathering with lots of fun, but it included a daughter, Betty, who was preparing for a trip by filling suitcases with beautiful scarves that she made. And he said to Rosemary, you have this ambivalence about what's happening to you. And, the things in a trip, there's many people when they're dying dream of trips, dream of moving, going on a trip, going on a voyage, packing suitcases. And there's some ambivalence going on here. In another story, they had a few different kinds. not just one other story, but in many other stories, there were a lot of different things going on, and he was able to identify themes. So one of the themes was the dead were waiting for them, just standing around waiting for the person to die, to be there for them, not to be spooky, but to be there for them. And that they had a quiet presence that felt like an embrace. There was love and guidance and no judgment. And Bridget's aunts were watching. That's an example of that. Then, as I mentioned, another theme is travel, preparing to travel, preparing to leave. It's not about the destination. That's unimportant. And it's not about anxiety. It's about peace. There's lots of boarding of various means of transportation in these dreams across all these patients. Julie was 71, 13 days before her death. She saw her mother and her 2 brothers, and they told her, "We're coming back in a while. We're coming back to pick you up for a trip." And these were very distinct from normal dreams. Everyone said they feel more real than real. I feel like I'm living them, not just observing them. I'm actually living them. The realism for them is 10 out of 10. 45% of these things happen during sleep. 16% happen during wakefulness, and 39% in both states. So there's this kind of fluid movement, shifting between dreams and waking, with alertness kind of equal in both cases. These dreams are vivid and impactful. And 91 kept saying, "Where's Emily?" Well, Emily was her sister, who had died 16 years previously, but she kept seeing her. And then when she didn't see her, she'd say, "Where did Emily go?" And she had a crisis in her health. And during it, she sat up and reached out into the nothing, into the air, just reached out like she was reaching for something. And like she saw somebody and said very clearly to the empty air, "Am I going to die now?" But she rallied. She again started asking for her sister. She said that her sister had been sitting waiting by the bed. She said she'd seen her walking around the room doing small chores, folding clothes, picking things up. They had walked together in her dream. She said, "I'm not going anywhere alone. Emily will be with me." She improved temporarily. Her dreams stopped. These visions often reconstruct memories to address the needs of the patient. An example, Tim, 73, had cancer, had grown up during the Depression. His family, dead family, came to him and told him, "Hey, you're going to be okay." They showed him himself as a boy, leaving his childhood home, kind of a metaphor. He saw his mother praying as he went out. She was very religious. And he met his best friend. So he was in his home. His dead family came to him and showed him this vision. He's in his home. He's a boy. He sees his mother praying. He moves out of the house, out into the yard, meets his best friend with baseball equipment. He had been his lifelong friend, and had also become his brother-in-law. He saw his dad doing work in the yard. He said his father had always struggled to find jobs. But there was a sense of worth and security that had been missing in his childhood and was restored. His old psychic wounds were healed. These were rich reenactments of the most important relations in his life before he died. When awake, this is exactly how Tim described the dreams, a reconnecting with love. Then there was Beverly with COPD at 89. Her dreams removed the person who had withheld love from her. She had had a very abusive mother. She didn't dream about her mother. In her dreams, her mother just was not there. Only her father, who gave her unconditional love, and he was a mail carrier, and she dreamed about reliving going on his route with him. She faced death with the love of her father, who was a source of security and love for her in life. So he began the study with no idea that these experiences were often healing of old wounds, but he soon found out. Scott, 88, during the Depression, at the age of 10, lost an arm jumping out of a train. He suffered a lot of teasing and struggle because of this injury. Even his mother feared him because she feared that he would not be able to get a job because he was not whole. She put him in foster care to get a better education because she didn't think he'd be able to do anything manual, but this increased his shame and decreased his sense of lovability. And this trauma was still haunting him up to the age of 88. And here he is near death, and he began to dream of good times at work. In his dreams, he excelled at fixing things, that became a handyman. Nobody else could do it. He could do it. And he was told he was a great worker and a great friend, and it was very healing for him. John, a war vet, had been haunted by the beaches at Normandy in World War II. He kept reviewing the carnage of D-Day. He was haunted by nightmares, and he had never spoken of them. He was sent to Omaha Beach to rescue the trapped, wounded people on the beach, and he saw haunting carnage. Dr. KERR could feel his terror from this. So several days later, he was smiling and at peace because he had a new dream. He dreamed of being discharged from the military and then of a soldier who had been killed on Omaha Beach. Some of them came to him, his former comrades who had died, and told him, "You're okay, don't worry, we're going to come back and we're going to get you." So he felt reunited, that he could rest. He felt forgiven because he had survivor's guilt. He felt now no longer judged. And even his most difficult dreams, this showed, could be beneficial. They fill the need for forgiveness, for love, for peace. Often the dying wait for a significant day before they die. They won't die until a birthday comes or an anniversary comes. Marcy, who was 98, would not die until her son Ronnie got there. She hadn't seen him in 8 years. And the next day in this study, she suddenly sat up and reached out to her dead husband, Amos. She said, "I can't come yet." She says to this, there's nobody there that anybody else can see. She sees her dead husband, Amos. She says, "I can't come yet. My son's coming." Her son, Ronnie, arrived later that day, and 24 hours later, she died. So it could be argued that the dying, going into dying, it's a progressive sleep, and you just need to relax and let go. She needed to find peace. Until Ronnie came, she couldn't. Dying is about love that endures and persists. Some people get resolution from these dreams, and some people use them to reflect on the past and to heal internally. Patricia, who was 90, was very smart, very witty, but immobile from lung disease. Her mother had had pneumonia when Patricia was 9. Her dad, in Patricia's life, her mom died of pneumonia. Her father died of lung disease when she was 13. This is terrible. She cared for him full time, and she had a great deal of maturity beyond her years. This is just after the Depression. So she started having what she called crazy dreams, and she was grateful to share the dreams and to learn about them. She didn't want morphine. She was surprised to hear that these sorts of dreams that she was dreaming of her mother and father were a common pattern, and she figured out more of the dreams and what they meant. And she also figured out that because she was having them more often, that she was becoming closer to death. And she wanted to know how close she actually was. She said the people in her dreams didn't mix their social circles, that her church friends didn't mix with other people, and that all of her sisters-in-law were together, but they didn't mix with her friends, that the settings were irrelevant. It was all about the interpersonal relationships. She recognized these were different from dreams you have when you're just asleep. She said, "I'm dying and I'm ready." And there's a poem here. "I don't know," this she wrote, Reflections on the Red Zone. I don't know how it works. I wonder every day, will some specter come to take my hand and lead me on my way? And what about those lights they see? Will they ever shine for me? I am more than ready every day. This is in her 90s. She'd begun painting and writing poetry in the last year of her life, and she saw death as a deliverance. This made her grown kids really uncomfortable. She would say things like, let's get on with this. And it made them really uncomfortable. She said, I can't help my family anymore. I'd like to have my mother come and tell me that it's okay. She said she'd like to take Chuck's hand and walk into an eternal sunset. I believe that was her husband. She had fear of the unknown, no sense of that, no sense of defeat. And she was content to leave. Let me see here. There's another little tidbit. To die to... Oh, this is a quote from Hamlet. Shakespeare. Shakespeare, I swear, he was an elevated being. To die to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. He knew. It's from Hamlet. So these experiences in these final days address a patient's need. Pat's last word to her mother at 9 years old when her mother died was, I got 100 on my arithmetic test today. And she said, it was the only gift I had to give her at the age of 9. So she died that night and was able to remember her mother. Before she died, she remembered her mother waving at invisible others in the room and turning to her daughter of 9 years old and telling her to say hello to these invisible entities in the room. So patients emerge from these experiences with positive psychological and spiritual changes, with growth. This transcends the physicality. It's therapeutic. So he asked Pat at one point, what would you like the most to see? And she said, my mother. So the next visit, she was unresponsive when he went in, and he whispered into her ear if she'd seen her mother. And she just kept her eyes shut. She was still sort of out of it, but she smiled and nodded and pointed up at the ceiling. So I'm going to end here on this chapter, end of this chapter. That was video 1. And we'll start with the next video here in a second. I hope you're enjoying this. This is really interesting, remarkable book, I thought. Very comforting book. And I'd be interested to hear people's experiences. If you've had relatives who've died and they've gone through stuff like this, I'd love to hear about. My own grandmother did. I'll tell you later. Okay. Slangafoil. Slancha.